The 8th of June, 793 AD. Dawn breaks over the holy island of Lindisfarne, a tiny speck of land off the coast of Northumbria. For the monks who live there, this day begins like any other. The world is a place of order, defined by prayer, manuscript illumination, and the tides. Their island is a beacon of learning, one of the holiest sites in Christendom, protected by the power of their God and the piety of their kings. The sea is their larder and their isolation, a barrier against the petty troubles of the mainland. It has never occurred to them that it could also be a highway. The first sign is a smudge on the horizon, a sail, but it is not a sail they recognize. It is square and striped, red and white, then more appear. They are not the clumsy merchant cogs that occasionally ply the coast. These are long, slender, and impossibly fast, like serpents cutting through the water. They move not just with the wind, but against it, propelled by the rhythmic flash of oar banks. A horn sounds, a low, mournful blast that cuts through the morning mist and chills the blood. For the monks, what happens next is an apocalypse. It is a tear in the fabric of their reality. Men pour from these dragon-proud ships roaring. They are not a disorganized rabble. They move with a terrifying, violent purpose. They carry round shields and bright axes. The monks, clutching their crosses, fall to their knees in prayer, expecting a miracle. None comes. The raiders are efficient. They kill those who resist and those who do not. They are not interested in conversion or dialogue. They are interested in gold, in silver, in the jewel-encrusted gospel books, and in the monks themselves, who can be sold as slaves. In a few short hours, Lindisfarne, the light of the north, is a smoking ruin. The survivors are few, and their message, when it reaches the court of the Northumbrian king, is one of pure, uncomprehending terror. Alcuin of York, a scholar at the court of the great Charlemagne, writes a letter trembling with dread. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. The question that echoed from the halls of kings in England to the scriptoriums of Francia was not just what happened, but who. Who were these men? Where, from the known map of the world, had this nightmare erupted? To the victims, they were heathens, pagans, Northmen. They seemed to be a force of nature, a divine punishment for their sins. But they were not demons, and they did not come from nowhere. They came from a land that Christian Europe had largely forgotten, a cold, harsh, and brutal crucible that had been forging a new kind of society and a new kind of warrior for 1,000 years. To understand the storm, we must first understand the world it was about to break. The late 8th century was not a primitive age. In the West, the great Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne was experiencing a renaissance, a rebirth of Roman ideals, order, and learning. It was a vast, land-based power, obsessed with its eastern borders, fighting Saxons and Avars. Its gaze was fixed inward and eastward. Its coasts, especially in the north, were an afterthought. In England, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia vied for supremacy. They were rich, built on wool and trade, and their monasteries were fat with the donations of pious kings. In Ireland, a patchwork of high kings and petty kings ruled over a society that was artistically brilliant, deeply Christian, and catastrophically undefended. The unifying feature of this world was its faith, its wealth, and its vulnerability. Its wealth was concentrated in undefended coastal and riverside monasteries, and its trade flowed through unprotected wick towns like Lundenwich and Quentovich. Its military thinking was land-based, a matter of slow-moving infantry levies and armoured nobles on horseback. Its sea power was negligible, consisting of clumsy merchant ships and small fishing vessels. The world was ordered, predictable, and though its rulers did not know it, utterly fragile. It was a locked treasure chest, and someone had just forged the key. That key was crafted in Scandinavia. We must immediately dispense with the cartoon. The Viking, the snarling barbarian in the horned helmet, is a fiction. The horned helmets were a 19th century invention for Wagnerian opera, a romantic fantasy. The reality is far more complex and infinitely more fascinating. These were not mindless brutes. They were shipbuilders of genius, poets of grim beauty, complex lawmakers, and the most ambitious traders and explorers the world had ever seen. They were also, without question, ruthlessly violent. Their culture was built on a different set of assumptions than the one they were attacking. Their homeland was a world defined by the sea. In the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, arable land was the most precious commodity. It was scarce, especially in Norway, a land of mountains and fjords. This scarcity bred intense competition. Society was not unified. There were no great nations here, not yet. There was only a mosaic of petty kingdoms and chiefdoms, ruled by jarls and kings whose power rested on a simple, brutal contract. A leader's authority came from his reputation. Reputation, drengskaper, was a combination of honor, courage, and above all, generosity. A jarl held his power only as long as he could attract and reward a herd, a personal retinue of elite warriors. To keep these warriors loyal, he had to provide for them weapons, armor, food, and most importantly, silver. A jarl who could not provide gifts would soon find himself a jarl with no warriors, and a jarl with no warriors would soon be a dead man. This system created a constant, pressurized demand for movable wealth. For centuries, this wealth had been acquired internally through raiding a neighbor, or externally through trade. Scandinavians had been trading with the Roman Empire and later its successor states for generations. They traded furs, amber, and slaves for wine, glass, and silver. They were already a part of the European economic system. But in the 8th century, several things changed. In the south, the Carolingians were expanding, and the trade routes for silver were shifting. At home, petty kings were beginning to consolidate power, pushing out their rivals. This push factor, land-hungry sons, exiled jarls, and ambitious warriors, was building. But a push is useless without a pull. The pull was the sheer undefended wealth of their Christian neighbors, a world they had heard about for decades from their merchants. They knew where the monasteries were. They knew where the trading towns were. They knew their targets were rich, and they suspected they were soft. All of these ingredients, a competitive honor culture, a political engine demanding wealth, and a rich, vulnerable target were simmering. They were missing only one component, the technological catalyst that would mix them into an explosive compound. By the middle of the 8th century, they had perfected it. It was the longship. The Scandinavian longship was not merely a boat. It was the single most advanced and disruptive piece of military technology on the planet. It was the result of centuries of evolution, a masterpiece of naval architecture. It was clinker-built, meaning its hull planks overlapped, giving it a unique combination of strength and flexibility. The ship did not fight the open ocean. It flexed with it, allowing it to survive storms that would have destroyed any other vessel. Its most revolutionary feature, however, was its draft. The ship was incredibly shallow. A warship capable of carrying 40 to 60 men could float in just 3 feet of water. This is the secret that unlocks the entire Viking Age. It meant the longship was a true amphibian. It could cross the terrifying emptiness of the North Sea, an ocean-going vessel of unparalleled speed. But it could also sail up the shallowest river, glide over a sandbar, and land on any beach. No other ship in the world could do this. A Byzantine dromon was a powerful warship, but it was trapped in the deep Mediterranean. A Frankish merchant cog was a high-sided cargo hauler, but it was slow and useless on a river. The longship was a hybrid, a shark that could swim in the ocean and also climb a tree. It was powered by 2 systems, a large square sail. Another recent innovation they had mastered gave it strategic range, allowing fleets to travel hundreds of miles with shocking speed. But in a fight or on a river, the sail came down and the ship was driven by oars. This gave it tactical supremacy. It did not need wind. It did not need a port. It could strike anywhere, at any time. and then vanish before a land-based army could even be mustered. This ship was the perfect weapon, built by a society that needed to expand. It was a passkey that could unlock any door, a weapon that turned Europe's greatest defenses, its seas and rivers, into its greatest weaknesses. The men who stepped off that ship at Lindisfarne were not monsters from the void. They were the product of a harsh land, a competitive culture, and a brilliant technological leap. They were poets and murderers, explorers and slavers. They were the sharp, hardened edge of Scandinavia, and they had just been launched against the soft, wealthy body of Christendom. The world before 793 AD was a world that believed it knew its own boundaries. The world after was one where nowhere was safe. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the start of the Viking Age, it was the announcement. The storm had a name, and it had arrived. The aftermath of Lindisfarne was a shockwave of spiritual and existential terror. Alcuin's letters were a plea for understanding, a frantic attempt to fit an anomalous event into a known worldview. To him, to the kings of Northumbria, to the Pope in Rome, this was a divine punishment, a scourge of God visited upon a sinful people. What other explanation could there be? These raiders were, in the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, heathen men. They had come from a void, a blank spot on the map marked only, "Here be monsters." But they were not monsters, and they did not come from a void. They came from a very real place, a place defined by a unique and brutal set of pressures. To understand the explosion of the Viking Age, we must stop thinking of Vikings as a people. It was not an ethnicity, it was in its purest form a job description. The Old Norse phrase, fara I Viking, meant to go on an expedition, or to go raiding. It was an activity, a summer enterprise for a young man looking to make his fortune and win his reputation. The men who sacked Lindisfarne were farmers, traders, and fishermen who had, for a season, taken up the axe and the oar. The question, then, is why? Why, in the last decade of the 8th century, did thousands of Scandinavian men simultaneously decide to engage in this violent enterprise? It was not a single cause, but a complex cocktail of triggers, a perfect storm of demography, politics, environment, and technology. First, we must understand the land. Scandinavia is breathtakingly beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. In Norway, the landscape is vertical. Majestic fjords cut deep into mountains that plunge directly into the sea, leaving only tiny, isolated ribbons of arable land. In Sweden, vast, dense forests and countless lakes cover a landscape that is difficult to farm. Only Denmark was relatively rich in farmland, but it was small and densely populated. In all three lands, land hunger was the defining social dynamic. Land was the only true measure of wealth, the source of status, and the key to survival. This scarcity was supercharged by a social structure built on competition. A jarl, or chieftain, held his power not by divine right, but by his drengskaper, his honor, prowess, and above all, his generosity. A jarl's power was his herd, his personal warband of elite herdmen. These warriors were not conscripts. They were ambitious followers who pledged their loyalty in exchange for treasure. A jarl who could not lead successful raids and return with silver, weapons, and slaves to distribute would not be a jarl for long. His herd would abandon him for a more successful, more generous leader. This system was a relentless engine demanding a constant, fresh supply of movable wealth. Now, add a demographic accelerant. Polygamy was common, at least for the wealthy. A powerful jarl might have several wives and many concubines. While this was excellent for demonstrating his status and siring allies, it produced a demographic time bomb, a surplus of high status, ambitious, and violent young men. Inheritance practices often favored the eldest son, who would get the family farm. But what of the second, third, and fourth sons? They were trained warriors, raised on tales of heroes, and possessed a burning desire to win their own honor and their own land. They had everything to gain and absolutely nothing to lose. This internal pressure was building for decades. For a time, It was vented through internal conflict, raiding your neighbor in the next fjord. But by the late 8th century, two things changed. First, political consolidation began. In Denmark and parts of Norway, ambitious kings were starting to centralize power, crushing lesser jarls and imposing taxes. For a proud, independent chieftain, the choice was stark. Bend the knee and become a vassal, or take your ship, your family, and your followers, and leave. The sea was an escape route, a highway to a new life where a man could be his own master. This political push created a steady stream of skilled, angry, and exiled warriors. Second, the pull. The Scandinavians were not ignorant of the world to their south. They were, and always had been, traders. They sold furs, amber, and slaves, often captured from their Baltic neighbors, in exchange for Frankish glass, Rhenish wine, and, most importantly, Arab silver. This silver, which flowed up the rivers of Russia from the Abbasid Caliphate, gave them a taste for precious metals. Through these trade routes, merchants returned with stories. They told of a land called England, rich in wool and grain. They told of Francia, weakened by civil war. And they told of the monasteries, unprotected, sitting on the coasts, brimming with gold, silver, and ivory, that their god, apparently, did not need to defend. The picture was complete. A demographic bomb of landless sons, a political pressure cooker of exiled jarls, an economic engine demanding silver, and a target list of wealthy, undefended neighbors. All that was needed was the weapon, and in the longship, they had the most perfect weapon the world had ever seen. The first raids were not invasions. They were a form of violent, high-risk entrepreneurship. The typical raid, the strandhug or strand strike, was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. It was not a battle, it was a harvest. Imagine a single longship, or perhaps a small fleet of 3. This is not an army. It is a lag, a team of perhaps 100 men. They are bound together by oaths to their leader. They know each other. They have sailed, rowed, and fought together for weeks. They are a single, hardened unit. Their target is chosen with care, a monastery like Iona, a rich coastal estate, or an undefended trading town. Their approach is their greatest weapon. They come from the sea, a direction no one is watching. They move with terrifying speed, propelled by sail and oar. They often strike at dawn, in the mist, or during a holy festival when the defenses are down. There is no warning. The sight of those dragon prows, an image that would become a sigil of terror for 300 years, is the first and only alarm. The attack is psychological as much as physical. The Northmen roar, banging their axes on their round lindenwood shields, invoking their gods, Odin and Thor. They are loud, fast, and utterly ruthless. They are not there to conquer, to convert, or to hold territory. They are there to do 3 things: kill anyone who resists, grab every item of movable wealth, and take captives. The gold from the altars, the silver from the chalices, the jeweled covers of the gospel books, these are melted down. But the most valuable commodity is human. Monks, nuns, villagers, and artisans are bound and dragged back to the ships. These thralls will be sold in the great slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby, or be kept as forced labour back on the farm in Norway. The entire operation, from landing to departure, might last only a few hours, before any local fyrd or militia can even be mustered. Before the local ealdorman can sound the alarm and gather his troops, the Vikings are gone. They have vanished back into the sea, leaving behind only smoke, corpses, and a community traumatized to its very core. This was the template, repeated with horrifying success from 793 onward. In 794 they struck Jarrow, the home of the great scholar Bede. In 795 they hit Iona in the Hebrides, the holy centre of the Celtic Church, and, in the same year, struck the Irish coast for the first time. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle becomes a grim staccato rhythm of disaster. Here the heathens ravaged and slew many. For the victims, it was like being attacked by ghosts. How do you fight an enemy who lives on the ocean, who does not need a harbour, who can strike 50 miles inland up a shallow river, and who moves faster than any army on earth? The answer, for decades, was that you didn't. You prayed, you paid, or you died. The longship had rendered every castle, every city wall, and every army in coastal Europe obsolete. But soon, the nature of the raids began to change. The raiders grew bolder, their fleets larger, and in one place in particular, they decided to stop leaving. That place was Ireland. Ireland in the 9th century was a perfect target. It was a land of saints and scholars, but it was not a nation. It was a patchwork quilt of over 100 petty kingdoms, or tuatha, loosely grouped under regional overkings. It was wealthy, its monasteries serving as the banks and artistic centers for their local kingdoms. And it was completely fatally unurbanized. There were no towns, no cities, no fortified ports. Its political system was based on cattle raiding, not siege warfare. It had no navy. It was, in military terms, an open treasure chest. After the first hit-and-run raids in 795, the Northmen returned, year after year. For 30 years, they simply harvested the coast. But around 830, the strategy shifted. The Annals of Ulster report that the fleets were becoming massive. 60 ships on the Boyne, 60 on the Liffey. They were no longer just hitting the coast. They were pushing deep inland, using Ireland's river systems like a network of veins. They struck the great monastic centre of Armagh, the holy city of St. Patrick, 3 times in a single month. The man who reputedly embodied this new, more sinister phase was a figure named Turgesius, or Thorgils. Whether he was a single person or a composite of several brutal warlords, the annals paint him as the first true conqueror. He allegedly sailed his fleet up the Shannon, plundered the monasteries of Clonmacnoise, and set his pagan wife, Ota, to perform heathen prophecies from the high altar. He built fortresses, demanded tribute, and for a time ruled as a king of all the foreigners in Ireland. This was the crucial innovation. The raiders started staying. To do this, they needed a base, a place to spend the winter, repair their ships, and store their plunder. They built fortified coastal camps called longforts, and in 841 AD, the Northmen established the most important longfort of all at a black pool on the River Liffey, in Irish Dublin. This was the birth of Dublin. It was not a city, it was a pirate base, a slave market, and a fortress. From this strategic position, the Vikings could now project power year-round. They could strike at will, playing the perpetually feuding Irish kings against one another. Soon, the Irish kings, adaptable and cynical, began to hire them. The heathens were now mercenaries in Ireland's internal wars. The Irish annals even began to distinguish between 2 different flavors of Viking: the Fingal, or fair Gentiles, who were primarily Norwegians, and the Dubgal, or dark Gentiles, who were Danes. These 2 groups hated each other as much as they fought the Irish. In 851, the dark Gentiles arrived and sacked the fair Gentiles' longfort at Dublin. The Vikings were now fighting Vikings for control of the lucrative Irish raiding and mercenary business. In Ireland, we see the first evolution of the raider. He came for gold, but he stayed for power. He built a camp. That camp became a fortress. That fortress became a trading post. And that trading post, generations later, would become one of Ireland's first and greatest cities. The Norse who settled here, the Ostmen, or men of the East, became integrated. They intermarried, adopted the Irish language, and eventually converted to Christianity. But they never lost their connection to the sea. They became a new hybrid people, the Hiberno Norse, a powerful force that would dominate the Irish Sea for 2 centuries. If Ireland was the laboratory where the raider learned to become a settler, the Carolingian Empire was the vault where he learned to become an extortionist. The Empire of Charlemagne was the superpower of the West. It was the resurrected Roman Empire, a vast unified Christian state stretching from Spain to the borders of Denmark. Charlemagne himself had recognized the Northmen's threat. Late in his life, he reportedly saw the dragon ships off his coast and wept, not from fear for himself, but for the sorrow that they will bring on my descendants and their lands. His sorrow was prophetic. Charlemagne's genius was the only thing holding his unwieldy empire together. After his death in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited. But Louis was no Charlemagne. When he died in 840, his three sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, immediately tore the empire apart in a vicious civil war. This was the moment the Vikings were waiting for. They were political masters of exploiting chaos. As the Frankish brothers fought each other, they left their coastlines and, more importantly, their rivers completely undefended. For the Vikings, the map of Francia was not a map of duchies and kingdoms. It was a map of rivers. The Rhine, the Scheldt, the Seine, the Loire. These were not defenses. They were invitations. They were saltwater highways leading directly to the richest, softest targets in Europe, the monasteries and the unprotected trading towns of Frisia. The raids began in earnest. They sacked the mint at Dorestad so many times it eventually just ceased to exist. They sailed up the Loire and established a permanent base on the island of Noirmoutier, from which they methodically terrorized the entire region, sacking Nantes and burning monasteries. They sailed up the Garonne and raided as far as Toulouse. But the greatest prize, the river that led to the heart of the kingdom, was the Seine. In 845, the full fury of this new strategy was unleashed. A massive fleet, reportedly 120 ships, entered the Seine. It was led by a figure who has become pure legend, Ragnar, or Reginerus as the Frankish annals call him. He may or may not be the Ragnar Lothbrok of the sagas, but his actions were devastatingly real. The king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, was desperate. He gathered his army, and in a disastrous tactical blunder, split it, placing one half on the north bank of the Seine and the other on the south. He thought he could trap the fleet. Ragnar showed him the flaw in his plan. He landed his forces on the island of Aucellus, ignored one half of the Frankish army, and made a concentrated, ferocious attack on the other. The Frankish division was annihilated. To complete the psychological victory, Ragnar took 111 of his prisoners and, in full view of the other Frankish army across the river, he hanged them. He dedicated them in a mass sacrifice to Odin. The remaining Frankish army, watching this pagan horror, broke and fled. The road to Paris was open. Ragnar's fleet sailed upriver and reached the city, then confined to the Ile de la Cité on Easter Sunday. The city was largely abandoned and undefended. The Vikings swarmed in, plundering the city and its rich surrounding abbeys, including the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. They looted, burned, and feasted, but they did not immediately leave. They waited. Ragnar knew he had the king in a trap. Charles the Bald was humiliated. His army was broken. His capital was occupied by heathens, and his nobles were demanding he do something. He could not fight, so he did the only other thing he could. He paid. Charles offered Ragnar a staggering sum, 7,000 pounds of silver. This was not a ransom. It was a payment for a service, the service of leaving. This was the first great Danegeld, the Dane payment, in Francia. Ragnar accepted. His men, laden with so much silver they could barely row, sailed back down the Seine. They had proven a fatal lesson, one that would define the next century of Frankish history. Terror was profitable. Francia would not fight. It would pay. This act of desperation set a catastrophic precedent. It was a short-term solution that created a long-term strategic nightmare. The Vikings now knew the price of a Frankish king's fear. Why risk your life in a shield wall against the Irish when you could sail to Paris and be handed a mountain of silver? They would be back. In 885, a far greater fleet would return and besiege Paris for an entire year, this time demanding even more. The asymmetry of warfare, perfected in the Strandhug, had now been scaled up to a national, even imperial level. The Northmen were no longer just raiders. They were a systemic, mobile, and parasitic force that could bleed the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe dry. They had evolved from coastal threats to continental predators, capable of striking the heart of an empire and forcing a king to his knees. The fury of the Northmen was not a passing storm. It was a new climate, and the world they had attacked would either have to adapt or it would drown. For 20 years, England, like Francia and Ireland, had bled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the heathen men as a recurring seasonal plague. They came, they burned, they killed, they took, and they left. The defences were useless. The payments of Danegeld only bought a few months of peace. It was a terrible but predictable cycle of extortion and violence. The English kings had come to understand and even manage this threat. They paid the silver, rebuilt their monasteries, and prayed for the Northmen to find easier prey elsewhere. Then, in the autumn of 865 AD, something changed. The cycle broke. A new fleet arrived on the shores of East Anglia. But this was not a fleet. It was an armada. The Chronicle calls it the Mysel Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. This was not a collection of independent lags or warbands out for a summer of plunder. This was a unified, professional and strategic force, numbering in the thousands, a scale of invasion not seen on British shores since the legions of Rome had departed. And it did not come to raid. It came to stay. The army that landed in East Anglia was different. It was a coalition, a grand alliance of Scandinavian kings and jarls who had, for a time, put aside their own rivalries for a single spectacular purpose: the conquest of England. This was not a hit and run. This was a shock and awe campaign, and it brought its own cavalry. The East Anglian king, seeing the sheer size of this force, did not fight. He did what had always worked before. He paid. He provided them with horses, believing he was buying their departure. He was wrong. He had just mounted the apocalypse. The great heathen army, now a fully mobile force, did not sail away. It rode. In 866, it marched north into the kingdom of Northumbria. And here, the Vikings' uncanny genius for political timing revealed itself. Northumbria, once the great northern kingdom of Bede and Lindisfarne, was tearing itself apart in a bloody civil war. Two rivals, Osbert and Ella, were fighting for the throne. They were so focused on their own private quarrel that they didn't even notice the Mysel here until it was at their capital. On All Saints' Day, November 1st, 866, the army stormed the city of Eoforwich. They scaled the old Roman walls and took the city with terrifying ease. The warring Northumbrian kings, stunned by this foreign occupation, did the only thing they could. They united. They declared a truce and marched their combined forces to retake their capital. This was the moment the army's leadership revealed its brilliance. The leaders of this force were not anonymous raiders. They were, according to the sagas, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether Ragnar himself was a real man or a composite of heroes, his sons were devastatingly real. There was Halfdan Ragnarsson, there was Urba, and there was the strategic mind behind the entire operation, Ivar, known to history as Ivar Hin Beinlausi, Ivar the Boneless. The name is a mystery that has haunted historians for centuries. Was he disabled, carried on a shield into battle? Did he suffer from a bone disease? Or was boneless, a terrible euphemism for his serpentine cunning, his unnatural flexibility of mind? The Frankish annals called him the cruelest of the Northmen, a man who ruled by terror and intellect. When the Northumbrian army arrived at York, Ivar was ready. The details of the battle are confused, but the outcome was not. The Vikings, now defenders, let the Northumbrians breach the walls, then counterattacked in the narrow streets. It was a slaughter. Both kings, Osbert and Ella, were killed. The Northumbrian army was annihilated. The legend, written centuries later, claims the sons of Ragnar captured King Ella, the man who had allegedly killed their father by casting him into a pit of snakes, and on his back they carved the Blodern, the blood eagle. This ritual, a horrific combination of torture and sacrifice to Odin, is as disputed as it is famous. Did it really happen? Was it a poetic invention of saga writers to emphasize the Vikings' pagan fury? Or was it a real, calculated act of political terror? In the end, it doesn't matter. The story of the Blood Eagle served its purpose. It was a message to the other kings of England. We are not the raiders you knew. We are not here for your silver. We are here for your lands, your crowns, and your lives. And we are driven by a vengeance that is more than human. With the deaths of its kings, the kingdom of Northumbria effectively ceased to exist. It had been one of the four great kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. Now it was a Viking possession. Ivar and Halfdan installed a puppet English king, a shadow king named Ecbert, to rule as their tax collector north of the River Tyne. The rest of the kingdom centered on the captured city of Eoforwich, which the Vikings now called Jorvik, became the first piece of what would be a new Scandinavian country on English soil. The great heathen army had been in England for just over a year, and one of the four kingdoms was already gone. The army spent a year consolidating its new power in the north. Then, in 869, it turned its attention south to the kingdom that had first paid them, East Anglia. The king of East Anglia was Edmund, or Edmund. He was a devout, traditional Anglo-Saxon king, known for his piety and his wealth. This time, when the army arrived, he did not pay. He gathered his forces and he fought. He lost. The Vikings, led by Ivar and Uber, overran his kingdom and captured him. What happened next would transform Edmund from a minor king into one of England's greatest saints. According to his biographer, Abbo of Fleury, the Vikings offered Edmund his life. He could rule as their vassal, a puppet king just like in Northumbria. If he would renounce his Christian faith and rule under their pagan authority, Edmund refused. He would not, he declared, submit to heathens or deny his Christ. Ivar, enraged, ordered an execution that was, in its own way, as theatrical as the Blood Eagle. Edmund was tied to a tree. He was scourged with whips. Then, the Viking archers used him for target practice, shooting arrows into his body until he bristled with them, like a porcupine. Finally, still alive, he was beheaded. His head was thrown into a deep thicket in the woods. The story, like Edmund's martyrdom, became a rallying cry. It was the ultimate contrast. The pious, civilized Christian king versus the godless, savage heathen. The cult of St. Edmund exploded, and he became the patron saint of England for centuries. But in 869, his sainthood was a political catastrophe. His kingdom was leaderless, his army shattered. East Anglia, the second of the four kingdoms, was extinguished. It was absorbed entirely into the growing Viking territory. The great heathen army now controlled the entire north and east of England. Only two kingdoms remained: Mercia, the great central kingdom, and Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons. In 871, the army struck south, marching on Wessex. But here, for the first time, the Vikings met real, organized, and brilliant resistance. The king of Wessex, Ethelred, and his younger brother, a scholarly, pious, and untested 22-year-old named Alfred, were waiting for them. The year 871 became known as Alfred's Year of Battles. It was a brutal, grinding, and inconclusive war. The Saxons and the Vikings clashed 9 times, at Reading, at Ashdown, at Basing, at Merton. At the Battle of Ashdown, the young Alfred, seeing the Viking army advancing while his brother the king was still hearing mass, had to make a choice: wait for the king and be overrun, or charge uphill against the pagan shield wall without the royal blessing. He chose to charge. The battle raged all day, a horrific meat grinder of shield on shield, axe on helm. In the end, it was a Saxon victory, a desperate, bloody repulse. But the victories were costly, and they didn't stop the army. The Vikings had what seemed like an inexhaustible supply of men. As new ships arrived to reinforce their losses, the Saxons were bleeding their kingdom dry just to hold the line. In the middle of this relentless campaign, King Ethelred died, probably from wounds sustained at the Battle of Merton. And so, in the crucible of a war for survival, the crown of the last free English kingdom passed to his 22-year-old brother. Alfred, the scholar who had wanted to be a priest, was now King Alfred. His first act as king was to watch his army be defeated by the Vikings at Wilton. His kingdom was on the verge of collapse. He had no men, no money, and no hope of victory. So Alfred did the one thing left to him, the thing he must have hated. He paid them. He gathered a massive Danegeld and bought a truce, Ivar the Boneless. A man who could smell a strategic advantage took the deal. Why bleed himself to death against the last, most stubborn kingdom when an easier prize lay right next door? The great heathen army, its pockets full of West Saxon silver, lifted its camp and, in 873, marched on Mercia. The kingdom of Mercia was, in many ways, the most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon states. Its great king, Offa, had once called himself King of the English. But Mercia was now ruled by King Burgred, a man who had watched the fates of Northumbria and East Anglia with growing dread. He had allied with Wessex. He had even married Alfred's sister. But now, the full, undivided attention of the Missel here was on him. The army didn't even bother with a summer campaign. It marched straight to the heart of Mercia, to its royal and spiritual capital, the fortress of Repton. Repton was a sacred site, the burial place of Mercia's greatest kings. The Vikings stormed it, and, in a profound act of symbolic dominance, they turned the monastery church itself into a part of their fortress. They dug a great D-shaped defensive ditch around it, incorporating the stone building into their rampart. Archaeologists digging there in the 20th century would find the evidence: the bones of the Viking dead, buried in a mass grave with one man, perhaps a leader, buried apart, a Thor's hammer pendant around his neck and a sword at his side. From this captured, fortified heart of his kingdom, the Vikings sat and waited. They spent the winter of 873-874 there. For King Burgred, it was the end. His kingdom was occupied, his capital desecrated. He could not raise an army to fight them, and he could not pay them enough to leave. His nerve broke. In 874, King Burgred of Mercia abdicated. He abandoned his kingdom, his people, and his crown, and fled to Rome, where he died a lonely pilgrim. With Burgred gone, Ivar and his generals completed their trifecta. They tore Mercia in two. The eastern half they kept for themselves. The western half they handed to a Mercian puppet, a foolish king's Than named Ceolwulf, who swore oaths of loyalty to the Vikings and promised to hand the kingdom over whenever they asked. It was 874. The invasion that had begun in 865 was, for all intents and purposes, complete. Northumbria was gone. East Anglia was gone. Mercia was gone. 3 of the 4 great kingdoms had been systematically, brilliantly, and ruthlessly dismantled and conquered. The entire north, centre, and east of England was now, in effect, a Viking state. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says grimly that the army shared out the land. They had stopped being an army and had started being settlers. Only one kingdom remained, a small, battered, and isolated kingdom in the southwest, the last kingdom, Wessex. At this moment of ultimate triumph, the great heathen army finally split. Its objectives had been achieved. Halfdan took a portion of the army north to finish the conquest of Northumbria and settle the lands around York. He would eventually die in Ireland, trying to claim the throne of Dublin. Ivar the Boneless, the mastermind, also disappears from the English record. He too, the annals say, went to Dublin, where he ruled as king of all the Norsemen of Ireland and Britain and died peacefully in 873. The army that remained in England, the one still focused on the unfinished business of Wessex, found a new leader. His name was Guthrum. Guthrum was a different kind of leader than the cunning Ivar. He was an old-school warlord, a summer king who craved the final, glorious victory. And in Alfred, he saw a king he had already beaten, a king who had paid him to go away. For 3 years, Guthrum played a cat-and-mouse game with Alfred, consolidating his new lands in Mercia and East Anglia. He settled his men, creating a new society. The army divided the land, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. The conquerors were becoming farmers. This was the birth of the Dane law. It was a new country, a place where the law was Danish, the rulers were Danish, and the gods were Thor and Odin. But Guthrum could not rest with Wessex still on his border. The conquest was incomplete, and in the dead of winter, in January 878, he did something no Viking army had ever done before. He launched a surprise winter attack. This was a violation of all the rules of 9th century warfare. Armies did not fight in winter. You rested, you gathered supplies. But Guthrum, based at Gloucester, saw an opportunity. Alfred and his court were celebrating Christmas and the Epiphany, 12th night, at the royal estate of Chippenham, deep in Wiltshire. They were feasting, unguarded, believing themselves safe. Guthrum's army rode hard and fast through the snow, falling on Chippenham in the middle of the night. The attack was a complete surprise, a total rout. The royal court was scattered, the Saxon guard cut down. Alfred himself, the king, barely escaped with his life. With a handful of bodyguards, he fled, humiliated, into the wilderness. This was the nadir. This was the end of Anglo-Saxon England. The king of the last kingdom was a fugitive in his own land. The great heathen army had won. Alfred fled to the marshes of Somerset, to a small, hidden island of dry land, surrounded by impenetrable swamp, called Athelney. For months he was not a king. He was a survivor. He waged a desperate, tiny guerrilla war from the fens, living in the huts of peasants. It is from this period that the most famous and probably fictional story of Alfred comes, the tale of the cakes. The legend says Alfred, disguised as a peasant, took shelter in a swineherd's hut. The swineherd's wife, not recognizing her king, asked him to watch some griddle cakes, a kind of flatbread she had baking on the hearth. Alfred, his mind consumed with the loss of his kingdom, his family and his God, sat and stared into the fire, lost in despair. He forgot the cakes and they burned. The woman returned and berated him furiously, scolding the lazy good-for-nothing who couldn't even watch a few cakes. The story is a parable, but it is a perfect one. This was Alfred's true test. He was not just a king who had lost his throne. He was a man who had lost his purpose. He was a scholar, a man of God, a truth-teller, and his world had been consumed by pagan, illiterate, and brutal chaos. Everything he believed in had failed. The cakes were burning. His kingdom was burning. But in that marsh, something hardened in Alfred. The pious scholar died, and a warrior king was born. He was not just fighting for his crown. He was fighting for his God, for the very idea of a Christian, literate, civilized England. He was the last man standing. From his hidden fortress at Athelney, Alfred began to send out runners. He sent messages to the ealdormen of the shires that had not yet submitted to Guthrum, Somerset, Wiltshire, parts of Hampshire. He was alive. The king was alive. And he was calling the fard. He was calling the militia, the free men of Wessex, to one last muster. He named the place Ecbert's Stone, a landmark on the edge of Selwood Forest. And in the 7th week after Easter, in the spring of 878, they came. The men of Wessex, who had thought their king was dead, saw his banner emerge from the forest. The Chronicle says their reaction was one of joy. After months of occupation and despair, they had a leader again. They had a cause. Guthrum was stunned. The king he had crushed at Chippenham, the fugitive he had dismissed, had just reappeared with a new, full-sized army. Guthrum gathered his own forces, the great heathen army of the Danelaw, and marched to meet him. The two armies met at a place called Eddington. This was not a raid. This was not a skirmish. This was the final deciding battle for the future of England. It would be a clash of two systems. For Guthrum, it was the final conquest. For Alfred, it was a war of extermination or survival. The battle was not a subtle affair of cavalry maneuvers. It was an Anglo-Saxon shield wall against a Viking shield wall. It was, the sources say, a brutal day-long slugging match. Two walls of wood, leather, and iron, pressing against each other. Men stabbing, hacking, and thrusting, trying to find a gap in the line. For hours, neither side broke. But Alfred's men were fighting for their homes, their families, and their king, who was in the front rank with them. The Vikings were fighting for plunder and for a land they had only just taken. In the end, it was the Vikings who broke. Their line fractured, the wall collapsed, and the retreat turned into a rout. The Saxons, who had been on the defensive for a decade, chased them, cutting them down as they ran. Guthrum and the survivors fled to their nearest fortress, Chippenham, the very place they had ambushed Alfred. Alfred's army followed, but it did not assault the walls. It did something the Vikings had taught them. It simply sat down and surrounded the fortress. It blockaded the town. The Vikings had plenty of weapons, but they had no food. After 14 days, the chronicle says the heathens were thoroughly terrified by hunger, by cold, and by fear. Guthrum sent an envoy. He would surrender, unconditionally. This was Alfred's moment of supreme victory. He had his mortal enemy trapped. The men in his army, who had seen their homes burned and their churches desecrated, wanted one thing: blood. They wanted Guthrum's head, and the heads of all his men. And here, Alfred showed his genius. He showed that he was not just a warrior, but a statesman. He knew that killing Guthrum would not end the war. It would only create a new martyr and a new cycle of revenge. He didn't just want to win a battle, he wanted to win the peace. He offered Guthrum terms, but they were not the terms of a conqueror. He did not demand the army leave. He did not demand their execution. He demanded two things. First, that Guthrum and his chief men be baptized. They must accept his God, the God who had given Alfred the victory at Edington. Second, he demanded that Guthrum formally accept a border. A few weeks later, at a place called Wedmore, the treaty was formalized. Guthrum, the Viking warlord, and 30 of his most important jarls were baptized as Christians. Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather. The Viking king took a new Christian name, Ethelstan. This was a political masterstroke. Alfred had not just defeated his enemy, he had converted him. He had made his rival his spiritual son. He had neutralized the pagan threat by absorbing it. The treaty signed at Wedmore changed the map of England forever. It drew a line running from the River Thames, up the River Lee to Bedford, then along the old Roman road of Watling Street, all the way to the border of Wales. To the south and west of that line was Alfred's Wessex. To the north and east was a new, independent, and legally recognized Viking kingdom, the Danelaw, Guthrum. As the Christian king Ethelstan retreated to East Anglia and ruled it, as promised, as a Christian king, he even minted coins in his new name, copying Alfred's own designs. The great heathen army, the conquerors, had finally been stopped, but they had conquered. Northumbria, East Anglia, and half of Mercia were now theirs, not as a raiders' camp, but as a homeland. The Vikings had come as raiders, seeking gold. They had stayed as conquerors, seeking land. And in the crucible of that long, terrible war, they had not only destroyed 3 ancient kingdoms, they had by that very act forged a new one. For in the fire of Edington, Alfred the Great had saved his kingdom. And in saving it, he had created the foundation for something that had never existed before. A single, unified nation, which the world would one day call England. While Alfred and Guthrum were drawing a bloody line across the map of England, that struggle, which seemed to them to be the center of the entire world, was just one single violent theater in a drama that was now unfolding on a global scale. The same pressures that had pushed the great heathen army across the North Sea were simultaneously pushing other Northmen in every other direction. The Viking Age was not a single invasion. It was an explosion, a great scattering. And in this expansion, we see the profound, almost contradictory nature of these people. While the Danes and Norwegians in the west were fighting for land and plunder, the Swedes in the east were seeking a different prize. They were not looking for farmland, they were looking for silver. Their path was not the whale road of the open ocean, but the river roads of the east, the Osterwege. This was a world away from the coasts of England. This was a vast dark continent of endless forest, impenetrable swamps, and nomadic, warlike tribes. To the Scandinavians, it was Gardariki, the kingdom of cities, a network of small, fortified trading posts along the great rivers that formed the arteries of Eastern Europe. The Volga, the Dnieper, the Dwina. The men who travelled this route were known as the Rus. The name itself is a mystery. It may come from an Old Norse word for rowers, or, more compellingly, it may be the name the local Finnic tribes gave them, Rutsi, their word for the Swedes. These Rus were not settlers, not at first. They were merchant adventurers, and their business was far more dangerous than anything in the West. This was not a quick sail to a soft monastery. This was an arduous, months-long expedition into a continent. Their longships, perfect for the ocean, had to be dragged for miles over muddy, forested portages to get from one river system to the next. They were preyed upon by nomadic horsemen from the steppe, like the Pechenegs, and had to fight for every mile. What pulled them forward? What made them endure this suffering? The same thing that pulled men anywhere: incredible wealth. But this wealth was not Christian gold. It was Islamic silver. The rivers of Russia were a conduit to the two greatest civilizations on earth. The Volga River Road led to the Caspian Sea and the lands of the Abbasid Caliphate, with its glittering capital at Baghdad. The Dnieper River Road flowed south, emptying into the Black Sea, and at its mouth lay the ultimate prize, the city they called Miklagard, the Great City, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople. In the east, the Russes did not just raid, they built. The native Slavic and Finnic tribes of the forest were numerous, but they were politically fragmented. The Russes arrived as a small, heavily armed, and brilliantly organized military elite. They did what the mafia would one day perfect. They offered protection. They established fortified posts like Aldeguborg and Novgorod and began to demand tribute from the local tribes. The tribute was not in silver, which the tribes did not have, but in the produce of the forest: honey, wax, and above all, fur. The soft, dark fur of the marten, the beaver, and the sable was soft gold, prized in the markets of the Caliphate and the Empire. The other commodity was human. Slaves captured from the Slavic tribes, whose very name would eventually become the root of the word slave. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, a history written centuries later, the tribes eventually grew tired of the chaos of their own feuds and the demands of the Rus. In 862, they allegedly sent a message across the Baltic to the Russes' chieftains. "Our land is great and rich," the invitation read, "but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Whether this invitation was real or a piece of later propaganda, the result was the same. A Rus chieftain named Rurik accepted. He settled in Novgorod, and from him a dynasty was born. His kinsman Oleg moved south and captured the small Slavic settlement of Kiev, declaring it the mother of all Rus cities. This was not a conquest in the same vein as the Danelaw. This was the birth of a new nation, a symbiotic and often brutal fusion of a small Scandinavian ruling class with a vast Slavic population. They were no longer just Vikings. They were the Kievan Rus, the founders of Russia. From their new capital at Kiev, they looked south. They were now at the head of the great Dnieper trade route, the road to the Greeks. They sent their convoys of ships, laden with furs and slaves, down the river. But as they knee-read the Black Sea, they had to pass a series of rapids, a terrifying gauntlet of white water. Here, they were forced to beach their ships and carry them, and their cargo for miles, all while fending off attacks from the Pecheneg nomads, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Porphyrogenitus wrote a detailed intelligence report on this trade, noting the dual Norse and Slavic names for the rapids, a perfect linguistic snapshot of this emerging hybrid culture. For those who survived the rapids and the nomads, the reward was sight of the city. To a warrior from the birch forests of the north, Constantinople was not just a city, it was a miracle. It was a city of 1,000-foot-wide marble streets, of palaces plated in gold, of the colossal hippodrome, and of the central wonder of the world, the Hagia Sophia, the great domed cathedral that seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain. The Rus did what Vikings always did when faced with overwhelming wealth. They tried to take it. In 860, a fleet of 200 Russes' ships appeared suddenly at the Bosphorus, catching the city completely undefended. The Emperor Michael III and his army were away, fighting the Arabs in Asia Minor. The Rus rampaged through the suburbs, slaughtering, burning, and drowning their victims. The city was in a panic. The Patriarch Photius, in a terrified sermon, described them as an obscure nation, a people from the ends of the earth. But Miklagard was not Lindisfarne. The city's massive Theodosian walls, the greatest fortifications in the world, held, and the Byzantines had a secret weapon. Their navy, upon its return, unleashed Greek fire. This was medieval napalm, a chemical accelerant that could be sprayed from siphons, setting the Rus ships ablaze. It was a terrifying supernatural weapon that burned on water. The Rus' fleet was annihilated. They tried again in 941, under their king, Igor, and again, the Greek fire devastated them. The Rus learned the same lesson the Franks had learned. Some targets you could not simply break, but, like in Francia, they learned a new lesson. If you could not break the city, you could make a deal with it. The Byzantines, for their part, were pragmatic. They saw the Russes not just as a threat, but as an opportunity. They were the most ferocious warriors they had ever encountered. And in the cynical world of Byzantine politics, an emperor always needed ferocious men who had no loyalty to any local political faction. They did what Rome had always done. They hired the barbarians. They signed a series of trade treaties with the Rus' princes, granting them special trading rights in the great city. And most importantly, they began to hire the Rus warriors as mercenaries. This was the birth of the most famous and feared military unit in the medieval world, the Varangian Guard. These were Northmen, now called Varangians, who took the emperor's shilling and became the personal, elite bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. They were quartered in the imperial palace. They stood guard, clad in mail and silk, outside the emperor's bedchamber. They were famous for their towering height, their blonde hair, and their signature weapon, the great two-handed Danish battle axe. They were known for their fanatical loyalty, a loyalty purchased with vast amounts of gold, and for their ferocity in battle. They were the iron pagan spine protecting the sophisticated Christian heart of the Roman Empire. This was the ultimate Viking career path. A poor boy from a Swedish farm could take the Osterweger, fight his way down the rivers, and, if he was strong and lucky, find himself in the Queen of Cities, a member of the Emperor's personal guard, earning a fortune in gold. The most famous of them all was a Norwegian prince named Harald Sigurdsson. In the 11th century, Harald fought for the Guard across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Jerusalem. He became immensely wealthy and, according to his saga, had to send his treasure home to Novgorod for safekeeping. He was so famous, he became known as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler. When he had earned enough gold and glory, he returned to Norway, claimed the throne, and in 1066 would use that vast Byzantine fortune to launch the last great Viking invasion of England, dying at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Varangian Guard was the Eastern Road, a path that led not to land, but to gold, glory, and for some, a crown. And this was not even the farthest they went. The other great river, the Volga, led to the Caspian Sea. From there, the Russes loaded their goods onto camels and travelled overland to the silver-rich markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. Our most vivid and disturbing portrait of these Eastern Vikings comes not from a Christian monk, but from an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In 921, Ibn Fadlan was sent on a mission from Baghdad and encountered a group of Rus' traders on the banks of the Volga. He was both fascinated and appalled. He described them as perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, but also the filthiest of God's creatures. He described a ritual where a chieftain would wash his face in a bowl of water, then blow his nose and spit into it, before passing the same bowl to his companion to do the same. But it was their funeral rites that truly horrified him. He witnessed the cremation of a great Rus' chieftain. The man was placed in his ship, along with his weapons, food, and sacrificed animals. But the ceremony required one more thing: a human sacrifice. A thrall, a slave girl, volunteered to join her master in the next world. Ibn Fadlan watched as the girl was given intoxicating drinks, ritually raped by the chieftain's men, and then, held down by two men, was strangled with a cord by an old woman called the Angel of Death. who simultaneously stabbed her between the ribs. The ship was then set on fire, a blazing human inferno sent to Odin. This account is priceless. It is a window, an external snapshot of the real pagan Vikings. Not the romantic heroes of the sagas, but a people of profound, alien, and brutal beliefs. It shows us that in the East, the Rus were a people of stark contrasts. They were the sophisticated founders of a new state in Kiev, the elite imperial bodyguards in Constantinople, and, on the banks of the Volga, ruthless pagan slavers. At the very same time that Rurik was building his fortress in Novgorod and Harald Hardrada was guarding the Byzantine emperor, an entirely different kind of Viking story was unfolding in the West. This story was not about following rivers to rich civilizations. It was about sailing away from civilization into a vast, empty, and terrifying unknown, the open Atlantic. The men who did this were not primarily Swedes but Norwegians, and they were not, by and large, seeking silver or glory in a foreign court. They were driven by the oldest Viking impulse of all, land hunger. This was supercharged by the political events back home. In the late 9th century, a king named Harald Fairhair was engaged in a brutal, decades-long campaign to unify all of Norway under his single, tyrannical rule. He was crushing the old, independent jarls and petty kings, imposing taxes and oaths of fealty. For many of these proud, fiercely independent chieftains, the choice was the same one their ancestors had faced: submit or leave. They would not bend the knee, so they took to their ships, packed their families, their livestock, and their thralls, and sailed not east to the cities of men, but west, into the void. Their first stop was the islands they already knew: Orkney, Shetland, the Faroes. But these filled up quickly. The real prize lay further out, a place of rumour and legend. Around 870, a Norwegian navigator named Nadod, attempting to sail to the Faroes, was blown far off course by a storm. He sailed for days, lost, until he sighted a new vast and unknown coastline. He landed but found no people. He climbed a mountain, looked for any sign of smoke, and saw none. As he sailed away, a snowstorm began, and he named the new country Snaeland, or Snowland. A few years later, a Swede named Gardar Svavason was also blown off course and found the same land. He, more methodically, circumnavigated it, proving it was an island. He too found it utterly uninhabited. He built a small hut, spent one winter, and left, naming it Gardasholmi, or Garda's Isle. The reports filtered back to Norway, a huge land, and no one lived there. It is likely that a few Irish monks, Papa, had lived there in ascetic isolation, but they either fled or were absorbed, leaving almost no trace. For the Jarls being crushed by Harald Fairhair, this was a promise. It was a new world, a blank slate, a place where a man could be his own master. The first permanent settler, according to the sagas, was a chieftain named Ingolfur Arnason. As he approached the coast, he performed the traditional ritual. He threw his carved wooden high-seat pillars, the symbols of his authority as a chieftain, overboard, and vowed to build his farm wherever the gods washed them ashore. He and his men then spent 3 years searching the coastline before they found them, in a bay on the southwest coast. He named the place Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, after the geothermal steam rising from the hot springs. This was the beginning of the Great Landnam, the land-taking. From roughly 874 to 930, a period of just 2 generations, tens of thousands of Norwegians fled the tyranny of King Harald and settled Iceland. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements written later, records the names and claims of over 400 principal settlers. This was a mass migration, an entire society transplanting itself into a new, raw, and volcanic landscape. The land they found was a paradox. It was a land of ice and fire, of glaciers and volcanoes, with a short, difficult growing season. But it was also a land of endless, lush pasture in the coastal lowlands. And most importantly, it was empty. There was no army to fight, no king to pay taxes to, It was a libertarian experiment on a vast frozen island. In this new land, these refugees did something remarkable. They were all jarls, all fiercely independent leaders. They needed a way to live together without a king. In 930 AD, the chieftains of Iceland gathered at a place called Thingvellir, the Thing Fields, a dramatic plain ripped apart by tectonic plates. And there, they founded the Alþingi, the Althing. This was a national parliament, an open-air assembly where all free men could gather. It was not a democracy in our sense, but a commonwealth, a proto-republic. The 39 chieftains, or godar, would meet for 2 weeks every summer to pass laws, settle disputes, and elect a law speaker, a man who had to memorize the entire legal code of the new nation and recite 1/3 of it from memory each year. This was the Viking spirit given a new form. Instead of a king, they had the law. In a land with no monarch, they created one of the most complex and sophisticated legal systems in the medieval world. And it was this society, isolated, literate, and obsessed with genealogy and history, that would, centuries later, write everything down. The poetic Eddas, which tell us of Odin and Thor, and the great sagas, which tell us of Ragnar Lothbrok and Ivar the Boneless, were almost all written in Iceland. They were the memory of the entire Viking world. But the drive west did not end in Iceland. The land was good, but it too filled up, and the Icelanders had inherited the Norse restlessness. They needed more land, and they were still, at heart, explorers. The next chapter belongs to one of the most archetypal Vikings who ever lived, Eric the Red. Eric was a problem. His father had been exiled from Norway for manslaughter. They settled in Iceland. Then Eric, true to his lineage, killed 2 men in a feud and was, in turn, exiled from Iceland for 3 years. He was an outlaw, a man with nowhere to go, a man who had been kicked out of 2 different Norse worlds. But he had heard rumors. An old sailor, Gunnbjörn Ulfsson, had, like Nadod before him, been blown off course and had sighted new land, barren skerries to the west of Iceland. Eric the Red, outlawed and defiant, decided he would find this land. In 982, he and a small band of followers sailed due west from Iceland into the unknown. He found the land, and it was terrible. It was a colossal island, 80% of which was covered by a permanent, mile-thick sheet of ice. But around the southern and western coasts, deep fjords, warmed by the Gulf Stream, offered just enough green pasture to support livestock. Eric, a born survivor, spent his 3 years of exile exploring this new, harsh coastline. When his exile was over, he sailed back to Iceland. He had a plan. He needed settlers to join him, to form a new colony. But how to sell a land of ice and rock? Eric, in a masterstroke of 9th century marketing, gave his new discovery a name. He called it Greenland. It worked. In 986, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships from Iceland, carrying hundreds of settlers, their families, and their animals to colonize Greenland. Only 14 ships made it. The rest were lost in the storms or turned back. But it was enough. They established 2 colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. They built farms, sod houses, and churches. They would convert to Christianity by the year 1000. They survived by farming, but mostly by hunting. They hunted walrus for their ivory tusks and seals for their skins, and traded these products of the north back to Europe. It was a marginal, brutal, and incredibly isolated existence, the farthest outpost of the European world. But it was from this tiny, precarious foothold in Greenland that the final leap would be made. The story of that leap belongs to Eric the Red's son, a man who grew up in that harsh land. Leif, son of Eric. Leif Erikson. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, trying to sail from Iceland to his father's new farm in Greenland, was blown off course by a storm. He sailed for days, lost in the fog. When the fog lifted, he saw a new land to the west, a land that was not Greenland. It was low, and it was covered in trees. To a man from Iceland or Greenland, a land of trees was paradise. Wood was the single most precious and scarcest resource. Bjarni, anxious to find his father, did not land. He turned his ship northeast and sailed away from this new land, eventually finding Greenland. In Greenland, his story was told, and Leif Erikson heard it. Leif, the saga says, was a large, strong man of most striking appearance and wise, a man of moderation in all things. Intrigued by Bjarni's report, Leif bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and, around the year 1000 AD, set out deliberately to find the land Bjarni had only seen from a distance. They sailed west and retraced Bjarni's journey in reverse. The first land they found was a land of flat stones and glaciers. Leif named it Helluland, Slabland. Today, we call it Baffin Island. It was not promising. They sailed south. The next land they found was flat and wooded, with white sand beaches. Leif named it Markland, Forest Land. Today this is Labrador in modern Canada. This was valuable. This was timber. They sailed south again, and after 2 more days, they landed on a new shore. What they found, to men who had grown up on the edge of an ice cap, was a Garden of Eden. The climate was mild. The rivers teemed with salmon, larger than they had ever seen. The forests were full of timber. And, most astonishingly, they found vinber, wild grapes growing. This was a land of wine. Leif named it, accordingly, Vinland. They built a small settlement of longhouses, a base camp for the winter, a place we are almost certain is the archaeological site discovered at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland. This was it. 500 years before Columbus, a handful of Vikings from Greenland had built a settlement in North America. But Vinland was not Iceland. It was not empty. The sagas call the natives Skraelingar, a derogatory term, perhaps meaning wretches or shriekers. The first contact was tentative, a silent trade of furs for milk, but it quickly turned violent, a dispute, a bull that got loose, a misunderstanding. It didn't matter. The Vikings, for the first time, met a native population that could, and did, fight back, fiercely, with numbers they could not match. After a few short years, the settlement failed. It was too far from home. The supply lines were too long, and the Skraelingar were too hostile. The Vikings abandoned Vinland. The contrast is breathtaking. In the very same historical window, one group of Scandinavians, the Varangians, were serving as the silk-clad, gold-paid, and ultra-civilized personal guard of the emperor in Constantinople, the richest city on earth. At the exact same moment, another group of Scandinavians, the Greenlanders, were building sod huts in Newfoundland, fighting with Stone Age natives at the absolute farthest, unknown edge of the world. This is the true, mind-boggling scope of the Viking Age. They were not just raiders of England. They were the connective tissue of the known world and the explorers of the unknown. They were a people who could found a state in Russia, serve an emperor in Byzantium, build a republic in Iceland, and stand, however briefly, on the shores of North America. They were the masters of both the river and the ocean, the ultimate expression of human restlessness. The Viking Age did not end. It dissolved. It did not die in a single cataclysmic battle. It was assimilated. It was absorbed into the very bloodstream of the cultures it had once terrorized, and in doing so, it transformed them and itself forever. The end of the Viking Age is the story of its ultimate success. The raider became a king, the pagan became a Christian, and the Northman became a European. The forces that had driven the first raids, land hunger, political instability, and the quest for wealth could not last. As the 9th century bled into the 10th, the world the Vikings had attacked began to adapt. Kings like Alfred the Great learned to fight back. They built navies, fortified their towns into burhs, and reorganized their armies. The era of easy plunder, the strand strike on the soft monastery, was over. Simultaneously, the targets themselves were changing. The sheer, relentless pressure of the Northmen was a catalyst for political centralization. In England, Alfred's son and grandson would use the struggle against the Danelaw as the driving force to conquer it, forging, for the first time, a single, unified kingdom of England. But the most profound change was happening within the Vikings themselves. The settler, by his very nature, has different concerns than the raider. The conqueror who settled in the Danelaw or in Ireland began to farm, to build, to trade. He had a permanent stake in the land, and to protect that stake, he needed stability, he needed laws, and most importantly, he needed to make peace with his neighbors. This inevitably meant engaging with the dominant cultural and religious force of Europe, the Church. The conversion of the Viking world was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, pragmatic, and political process. It happened from the top down and the bottom up. In the Danelaw, Guthrum's baptism was a political necessity, the price of peace with Alfred. But for his followers, who now lived surrounded by a vast Christian population, intermarried with Christian women, and traded with Christian merchants, the old gods began to fade. Thor and Odin were gods of the warband and the raid. The White Christ was the god of kingdoms, of cities, of trade networks, and of the written law. To be a king in 10th century Europe, you had to be a Christian king. The newly forming kingdoms of Scandinavia itself felt this pressure. To be recognized as a legitimate monarch, to trade with the great powers of Francia and the German Empire, a king had to convert. Harald Bluetooth in Denmark did so, proclaiming on his great runestone at Jelling that he had made the Danes Christian. In Norway, kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf the Saint, himself a former Viking, would impose the new faith with brutal missionary zeal. The age of the bloodlines was over. The age of the cross had begun. Nowhere is this transformation from raider to ruler more perfectly encapsulated than in the birth of Normandy, while England was fighting for its life against the great heathen army. Francia was still suffering the death by 1,000 cuts. The Danegeld payments had become an unsustainable national budget item. The Vikings were no longer just a coastal threat. They were a permanent parasitic presence, sailing the Seine and the Loire at will. In 1885, a truly colossal army, perhaps the largest ever assembled, returned to Paris. This time, led by a chieftain named Siegfried, they didn't just raid, they besieged the city for an entire year. The city only held by the heroic, desperate defense led by Count Odo. The Frankish kingdom was breaking apart under the strain. By the early 10th century, a new Viking warlord had made the Lower Seine his personal kingdom. His name was Hrolfr, or Rollo. He was a giant, supposedly so large that no horse could carry him, forcing him to walk. He and his men were the gatekeepers of the river. They terrorized Paris, they pillaged Chartres, and they had become a problem that the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, could not solve with an army. So, in 911 AD, Charles tried something radical. He did not offer Rollo gold to leave. He offered him land to stay. At a meeting at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, Charles made Rollo an offer. He would grant Rollo and his Northmen the entire county of Rouen, the rich lands of the Lower Seine. It would be theirs, legally, as a duchy. But in exchange, Rollo had to do 3 things. First, he must be baptized as a Christian. Second, he must marry the king's daughter, Gisela. And third, and most crucially, he must become a vassal of the Frankish crown and use his army to defend the river Seine from all other Vikings. Charles had, in a single brilliant move, turned his greatest poacher into his most ferocious gamekeeper. Rollo, a pragmatist, accepted. The baptism, of course, was a political formality. It's said that on his deathbed, the newly Christian Duke Rollo gave £100 of gold to the local churches, and then, just to be safe, had 100 prisoners hanged in sacrifice to Odin. But his descendants did not share his ambiguity. These Northmen quickly adopted the French language, the French legal system, and the French methods of warfare, particularly the use of heavy cavalry. They adopted the Christian faith with a convert's fiery zeal, becoming patrons of vast, new monasteries. Within 2 generations, the wild, pagan, Norse-speaking Vikings had vanished. In their place stood a new people, the Normans. They were French in language and culture, but they never lost their Scandinavian core. They were still restless, ambitious, legendarily violent, and brilliant organizers. They were, in effect, a new and improved model of Viking, hidden beneath a veneer of French piety. And these Normans, from their new duchy, would soon explode outward, conquering England, southern Italy, and even Antioch in a second Viking Age. While Normandy was being born, England was experiencing its own, even more complex transformation. Alfred's descendants had successfully conquered the Danelaw, creating a united England. But the connection to Scandinavia was not broken. A new final wave of invasions began at the end of the 10th century, this time not by disorganized armies, but by the newly Christian kings of a unified Denmark. In 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard invaded, and this time the exhausted, badly led English did not fight. They submitted. Sweyn was crowned King of England, and after his death, his son took the throne. His son was Knut, known to history as Knut the Great. Knut was the ultimate synthesis of the entire Viking Age. He was a Danish king who ruled England, not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate, Christian, and profoundly effective Anglo-Saxon monarch. He married the widow of the English king he had defeated. He patronized the English church. He upheld English law. He was at the same time the King of Denmark and the King of Norway, as well as ruling parts of Sweden. This was the North Sea Empire, a single, vast political and economic union held together by one Viking that connected the entire Scandinavian world with the wealth and power of England. It was the peaceful political culmination of everything the great heathen army had fought for. It was a Viking empire, but it was also a Christian and European one. It was a testament to how far the Northmen had come, from the raiders of Lindisfarne to the imperial masters of the north. Knut's empire was a personal one, however. It was held together by his own brilliance, and when he died in 1035, his sons were not his equal. The empire shattered. The English throne reverted back to the old Anglo-Saxon line, to a pious, weak king named Edward the Confessor. And this set the stage for the final act, the perfect historical bookend. The year 1066, when Edward the Confessor died childless, 3 men claimed the throne of England. 3 men, all of whom, in one way or another, were the children of the Viking Age. The first was Harold Godwinson, the greatest Anglo-Saxon earl. He was English, but his mother was Danish, a relative of Knut. He was the product of the fused Anglo-Scandinavian Danelaw. The second was William, the Duke of Normandy. He was the great-great-great-grandson of the raider Rollo. He was French-speaking, a brilliant and ruthless cavalry commander, a product of the Vikings who had become Frankish. And the third, the true ghost of the past, was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, the man who had fought in the Varangian Guard, the thunderbolt of the north, who had earned his fortune in Constantinople. He was the last of the great summer kings, a pure, old-school Viking warlord who saw the chaos in England as a final, glorious opportunity for a smash-and-grab conquest. In the autumn of 1066, the storm broke. Harald Hardrada, the last Viking, invaded the north of England. Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king, performed a military miracle. He force-marched his army, the English Third, 185 miles in 4 days, catching the Norwegian army completely by surprise at a bridge near York, called Stamford Bridge. The battle was a savage, brutal throwback to the old wars. It was an axe battle, a shield wall against a shield wall. Hardrada, fighting like a berserker without his mail armor, was shot in the throat with an arrow and died. The last great Viking invasion was shattered, its king dead in a muddy Yorkshire field. The English had won. The Viking Age, as a military threat, was over, finished by the very kingdom it had helped to forge. Harold Godwinson had no time to celebrate. He was at his victory feast in York when a messenger arrived, breathless. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy had landed his army in the south. Harold had to do the impossible. He turned his exhausted, battered army around and force-marched them the entire length of England, 240 miles south. In less than 2 weeks, his men had fought one apocalyptic battle and marched over 400 miles. On October 14th, 1066, on a hill near the town of Hastings, the exhausted English shield wall. The army of Alfred formed up one last time. Below them, the Norman army, the army of Rollo, prepared for battle. This was not a clash of Vikings and Saxons. This was a clash between two different descendants of the Viking Age. It was the Anglo-Danish axeman against the Norman-French knight. It was the old world of the shield wall against the new world of the mounted armoured cavalry charge. For an entire day, the English held. The shield wall, the ancient formation that had defeated Guthrum at Edington, held against the Norman knights. But in the late afternoon, Harold Godwinson was struck by an arrow and killed. The English line broke. The Normans charged, and the Anglo-Saxon state was destroyed. The man who was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066 was William the Conqueror, a man who, just 6 generations earlier, had been a pagan raider from Norway. The Northmen had finally, definitively, conquered all of England. They did it not as Vikings, but as French-speaking, Christian knights. This is the legacy. The Vikings did not just raid history. They made it. The dragon prow of the longship cut a wake that all of subsequent history would follow. They were the raiders who, by attacking, forced the creation of modern nations. They were the conquerors who settled, assimilated, and became the new ruling class. They were the explorers who bound the known world from Baghdad to Newfoundland. And they were the mercenaries who guarded the Roman emperor. Their legacy is in the borders of the map, in the DNA of the people of England, Russia and France, and in our language itself. Words like sky, skin, law, window, anger, and dream are not English. They are Norse. They are the words the Vikings brought with them, a permanent linguistic footprint of their time as rulers. The storm that began at Lindisfarne did not just blow over. It changed the weather of the world. It irrigated the soil. And from that violent, blood-soaked ground, new nations, new cultures, and a new era, our own, were born.